Her name was Honora Vane, and on the night this story begins, she was seated below the salt at the far cold end of a Mayfair ballroom, holding another woman's shawl the way a coat stand holds a coat. She was 31 years old. She was a paid companion. And that night, a beauty in primrose silk crossed the floor toward her, plucked a used dance card from her own wrist, and let it fall at Honora's feet, not handed. Dropped, the way you drop a thing for a dog to fetch. Honora did not flush. She did not weep. She bent, she picked up the card, and she folded the borrowed shawl over her arm, neat as a pressed sheet. Then, the wit stood up. Sir Julian Frayne was the toast of the season. 40 guests turned when he lifted his glass. He toasted the great anonymous genius of the age, the author every soul in London was quoting that year, a man called Gideon Hart. And then he turned, and he gestured across the whole bright room, straight at the plain woman holding the shawl, and he said it loud enough for all 40 to hear. Some are born to write immortal lines. Others, my dear, others are born to carry them. The room laughed. It laughed easily, the way rooms do when the target cannot laugh back. Now look at her hands. Just for a moment, look where no one in that room ever looked. On the middle finger of her right hand there was a stain. Ink, old ink, worked deep into the skin, the kind no soap will lift and no glove will hide for long. And in her lap, always in her lap, a small locked writing box of rosewood that she carried everywhere and set down for no one. Every soul in that room had memorized a sentence she had written in the dark. Not one of them had ever looked at her hands. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, if you have ever been the quietest person in a loud room and the cleverest, and no one knew, then this story is for you. Before we go on, do one small thing for me. Subscribe so the story finds you again, and leave a comment telling me the city you're watching from. I want to see how far Honora's story travels. Go on. I'll wait. Now, let me tell you who she was, before the world learned what it had been laughing at. Honora Vane was the only daughter of a country clergyman, a gentleman, a bookish man, a man with a great warm library and no head at all for money. When he died, he left her 2 things. He left her a mind stocked with every book on his shelves, and he left her his debts. The debts were larger. They swallowed the parsonage, the library, the little glebe field, the horse. They swallowed the future of a gently raised girl who woke one morning at 19 with an education fit for a duchess and not a shilling to her name. There was one respectable road open to a woman like that. Just one. She became a companion. A lady's companion is a curious creature, if you have never known one. She is not a servant, so she cannot eat in the kitchen with people who might be kind to her. She is not family, so she cannot sit at the table as herself. She lives in the thin, cold country between the two. She fetches the shawl. She reads aloud when the lady's eyes are tired. She takes the far seat in the carriage, riding backward. She is, in the polite word of the age, tolerated. For 11 years, Honora was tolerated. And she was good at it. She had learned young how to make herself small and smooth and quiet, a grey shape in the corner of grand rooms. It kept the peace, it kept the post, and the post kept her fed. Her mistress was Mrs. Cordelia Ashford, a widow of 58, wide of hip and warm of manner, forever a little frightened of the world's opinion. Mrs. Ashford kept a good house in a good street and a good box at the theatre, and the whole of fashionable London believed her comfortably rich. She was not. But we will come to that. What matters now is the thing no one knew, the thing that made Honora Vane different from every other tolerated grey shape in every other grand corner in London. At night, when the house was asleep, Honora wrote. She had always written. As a girl, she scribbled in the margins of her father's sermons. As a companion, she wrote by the end of a candle, after Mrs. Ashford had been settled and the last lamp doused, propping her little rosewood box on her knees, its lid a writing slope, the ink going cold in the small hours. She wrote because she could not write. She wrote the truth as she saw it, the way a clever woman is passed over, the way a good man is ruined by kindness, the way a whole society can look at a person for 11 years and never once see her. And 2 years before this story begins, penniless and desperate, with a quarter's wages owing and her boots worn through, she had done a bold thing. She had taken the manuscript of a novel, a full novel, finished in stolen candle hours over 3 winters, and she had carried it to a publisher. His name was Mr. Absalom Reed, a careful, dry, decent man of 55, with ink under his own nails and no patience for fools. He read the manuscript in one night. He told her the next morning that it was the finest thing to cross his desk in 20 years. And then he told her the truth of the trade. A novel by an unknown woman would be reviewed, if at all, as a curiosity, a pretty accomplishment, a lady's toy. But a novel by an unknown man, an anonymous man, a mystery man, a man of obvious genius who hid his face, why, that was an event. That would sell, so they invented one. They christened him Gideon Hart, a name from nowhere for a man who did not exist. Honora needed money more than she needed her name on a spine. She took a flat £90 for the book, outright, and kept only a small royalty on each copy sold, a thing so slight that Mr. Reed near talked her out of it, so few copies did anyone expect to sell. £90. She paid her cobbler and her back wages, and she thought that was the end of it. The novel was called The Hawthorne Legacy. You know already, because you are cleverer than the ton, that it did not end there. The Hawthorne Legacy did not sell a few hundred copies. It sold and sold and sold. It went into a second printing before the first was cold, then a third, then a fifth. Duchesses wept over it in their carriages. Young men learned whole passages by heart to murmur at supper. Clergymen preached against it and doubled its fame. By the season this story tells of, you could not enter a drawing-room in London without hearing the name Gideon Hart spoken the way other ages spoke of saints. And the woman who wrote it fetched the shawls. She kept the secret close as her own heartbeat. She had to. A companion who wrote novels would be dismissed within the hour. A companion who wrote that novel, the scandalous, clear-eyed, true one, would never find another post as long as she lived. Her invisibility was not a wound only. It was a wall. It was the thing that kept her safe. She had told herself that so many times she had come to believe it all the way down that her worth had to stay hidden or it would cost her everything. So she carried the little rosewood box everywhere, and she let the world believe it held her letters. Old letters, a companion's few sad keepsakes. That is what everyone assumed. No one asked. Why would they ask? You do not wonder what is inside a grey woman's box. Inside was the pen and the ink and half of a second novel. Now let me take you into the season itself. Because the cruelty of that spring was not one blow. It was 100 small ones, and they fell in a particular rhythm, and I want you to feel every one, so that when the turn comes, and it comes, you feel that too. It began, as these things do, at a supper. Mrs. Ashford was fond of suppers. She could not always afford them, though she did not yet know quite how badly, and Honora sat where she always sat, at the low end near the door, close enough to be summoned and far enough to be forgotten. The talk that night was all of one book. It was always all of one book that season. A young man down the table set down his fork and declared that there had never been a sentence written in the English tongue to equal a certain line in the 3rd volume of the Hawthorne Legacy. He recited it. He recited it badly, dropping a word, but he recited it with his whole soul. Honora knew the line. She had written it at 2 a.m. with a cold in her chest and a guttering candle, and she had crossed it out twice before she got it right. She said nothing. She buttered her bread. Down the table, the talk turned to what the line meant, and here the room grew warm, because interpreting Gideon Hart was the great sport of the season, and its acknowledged champion was Sir Julian Frayne. Frayne had built his whole fame on the back of a book he thought a man had written. He published essays on it. Long, admired, expensive essays, in which he explained to a grateful public exactly what Gideon Hart had meant by this passage and that, what dark private wound had produced this image, what classical learning lay behind that turn of phrase. He was, the world agreed, the finest literary mind of the age, the man who understood the genius no one could find. He leaned back now and told the table what the line truly meant. He was eloquent. He was confident. He was, Honora noted quietly into her bread, entirely wrong. He had taken a line she had written about a woman's endurance and turned it into a line about a soldier's glory. He had missed her by a mile, and the whole table nodded as though God had spoken. She did not correct him. Of course she did not. But something in her, some small warm ember, was almost amused. It is a strange thing to sit in a corner and hear the cleverest man in London explain your own heart to you, and get it backwards, while 40 people applaud. That was the first entertainment. There were others. At the second, a musical evening 2 nights later, a great lady spent the whole of the interval declaring that Gideon Hart must be a nobleman in disguise, for no common person could possibly write with such refinement of feeling. Common people, she explained to the room, did not feel refined things. It stood to reason. Honora, sitting behind her chair, holding her fan and her smelling salts and her spare gloves, kept her face perfectly still, and at that same evening came the first of the small clues that you, watching, will catch, though not a soul in the room did. A gentleman near the pianoforte noticed the stain on Honora's finger, that ugly dark mark on the middle finger of the right hand. He wrinkled his nose at it. He murmured to his neighbour that it was a pity how these lower sort of persons never could get themselves quite clean, ink or coal or some such grime. A servant's mark, he said, and he moved his chair a little away from her, as though it might be catching. An ink stain. On the finger of a companion. He looked straight at the one true sign of what she was, the mark the pen leaves on the hand that writes for hours in the dark, and he read it as dirt. He read genius as grime and turned his chair away. You saw it. He did not. Then came the third entertainment, and with it a second clue, sharper than the first. It was a card party at a fashionable house, and again the talk swung to Hawthorne, as a compass swings to north. A languid young woman, bored with her hand, turned idly to the grey companion in the corner, half to be kind, half to be cruel, the way the bored are, and asked whether even Miss Vane had contrived to read the famous book. Honora might have said no, it would have been safer. But she was tired that night, tired in her bones, and the languid voice pricked at her, and she answered before her caution could stop her mouth. She said, quietly, that she had. And then she said a little more. She said that she thought the truest thing in the whole story was a single sentence, and she spoke it aloud. The room, half listening, did not catch that the sentence she spoke was not in the book. It was not in the Hawthorne legacy at all. It was a line from the second novel, the unfinished one, in the rosewood box, that no living eye but hers had read. It had risen up in her without her willing it, because to her the 2 books were one long truth, and in her weariness she had let a page of the unpublished one slip out into the lamplight. Sir Julian Frayne was there. He heard her. And he laughed. He informed the table kindly, as one corrects a child, that the companion had muddled her quotation, as companions will, that the line was nothing like the master's actual words, and that it was charming, really, how the lower orders tried to ape their betters and always got the words in a tangle. A companion's muddle, he called it. The table smiled. She had just spoken a sentence of pure genius that no printed page on earth contained, and the finest critic of the age heard it and called it a servant's mistake. Do you feel it now? The gap, the terrible widening gap between what they saw and what was true. Hold on to it. It is going to grow wider before it closes, and when it closes, it is going to close all at once. Miss Seraphina Blythe was at that card party too. I must tell you about Miss Blythe, because she matters later, more than anyone yet suspects. She was 24 and the beauty of the season, and she had set her whole considerable will on one prize. She meant to marry Sir Julian Frayne, not for love, for fame. Frayne was the man who owned Gideon Hart. In the only way the age understood ownership, he owned the meaning of him, the mystery, the glamour. To stand at Frayne's side was to stand nearest the century's genius. Miss Blythe wanted that place, and she was used to getting the places she wanted. That night at the card party, Miss Blythe dropped her glove. Honora, from her corner, rose and fetched it, as was expected, and held it out. And Miss Blythe took it, looked at the plain grey woman offering it, and, with the smallest, sweetest smile, let it fall again. Right at Honora's feet, so that she must stoop and fetch it twice. It was nothing. It was a glove. And it was the whole of how the world was arranged, in one small gesture, and everyone who saw it understood, and everyone who saw it thought it charming. Honora fetched the glove the second time. She always did. She had learned long ago that the grey shape in the corner does not fight over a glove. But you should know, I want you to know, that as she straightened, the little rosewood box was under her other arm, held close, and inside it, in her own hand, in ink that stained her finger, were sentences that would one day empty the smile clean off Miss Seraphina Blythe's face. Not yet. But one day. Now, we come to the worst of it. The loudest of it. The night the whole season's cruelty gathered itself into a single moment and did its very worst, in front of 40 people, in a blaze of candlelight, at the grandest gathering of them all. There was to be a great literary soir, the finest houses, the finest minds, the whole glittering apparatus of fashionable London, assembled for one purpose, to honour the unknown Gideon Hart, to toast the genius no one had met. There were to be readings, there were to be speeches. Sir Julian Frayne was to give the address of the evening, and the address of the evening was the summit of his whole career. The man who understood Gideon Hart, standing before all London, explaining the master they all adored. Mrs. Ashford was invited, and so Honora went, in her one good grey gown, to hold whatever wanted holding. And Gideon Hart was in the room. Gideon Hart was standing against the wall in a grey gown holding Mrs. Ashford's fan, and not one of the 40 knew it, and the whole vast beautiful room was gathered to worship her, and she was invisible. Think of that. I want you to truly think of it. She had written every word they had come to worship, and she stood among them like a piece of the furniture, and the man about to lecture on the meaning of her soul did not know her face. Frayne gave his address. It was, everyone agreed, magnificent. He spoke for half an hour on the deep hidden meanings of the Hawthorne legacy, and he was wrong about most of them, gloriously wrong in the grand confident manner that passes for insight. And the room hung on every word and wept in the right places, and when he was done, flushed with triumph, wanting a last flourish, his eye fell on the grey woman by the wall. He had a bound set of his own collected essays on the table beside him, his writings on Gideon Hart handsomely printed, the sum of his fame. And an idea came to him, a witty idea. The kind of idea that makes a clever, cruel man beloved by a cruel, clever room. He took a shilling from his pocket. He held it up so it caught the light, and he called across the whole assembly to Mrs. Ashford's companion. He offered her the shilling. A whole shilling, he said, if she would carry his collected essays out to his carriage, since carrying words, he said, was so plainly her particular gift. The room understood him at once. The room roared, "Carrying words is your gift." He had said it before, at the ball, below the salt. Now he said it again, polished and public, to twice the crowd, and this time he put a coin on it, the way you tip a porter. 40 faces turned to watch, 40 people, laughing, waiting to see the grey woman scuttle and stoop and take the shilling and be grateful. Honora looked at the shilling, she looked at the man holding it, and she did something that made the laughter falter, though not one of them understood why. She did not scuttle, she did not flush, or weep, or protest. She crossed the room slowly, in the full sight of all of them, and she picked up the heavy-bound set of Sir Julian Frayne's collected essays, his life's pride, his interpretations of her own book, and she carried it, not out to the carriage, but to the table at the front of the room. And she set it down. Gently, the way you set down something you have decided you are finished with. And then she looked at the shilling in his hand, and she did not take it. She let it lie where he had put it on the table, small and bright and untouched, and she turned, and she walked back to her place by the wall, and she picked up Mrs. Ashford's fan again. She left him holding out a coin no one had accepted, in a room that had for one strange moment forgotten how to laugh. It was the most dignified thing many of them had ever seen, and they could not have told you why it unsettled them so. They only knew that the grey woman had somehow, without a word, without a raised voice, made the shilling look small, and the great Sir Julian Frayne look smaller. The moment passed. The laughter closed over it again, the way water closes over a dropped stone. Someone struck up the music. The evening rolled on, and by morning most of them had forgotten it entirely. She had not forgotten. And you will not forget, because that shilling comes back too. That was the peak of their cruelty. Now the story turns, and the turning begins with a letter. It came on a grey, wet Tuesday, 3 weeks after the soir, and it came to Mrs. Ashford's house in Curzon Street, and it was from a bank. The bank was called Coutance and Hollis. It was a careful, old, patient sort of bank, and its letter was very polite, and it destroyed everything. Honora was in the morning room when she heard the cry. She went at once, as a companion goes, and found her mistress in a chair with the letter shaking in her hand and all the colour gone out of her broad, kind face. The truth came out in pieces, between sobs, over the next hour. Mrs. Ashford was not rich. Mrs. Ashford had not been rich for years. Her late husband, that jovial, admired man, had died leaving debts as neat and hidden as folded linen, and she had kept them folded ever since, borrowing against the house, borrowing against the next quarter, keeping up the box at the theatre and the Good Street and the suppers she could not afford, all to keep her face before a world that would drop her the instant it knew. And now the folded linen had come open. There was a mortgage on the house. £4,000, and Coutance and Hollis, so very politely, required it paid in full at Michaelmas, 61 days off, or they would take the house. £4,000. 61 days. Or the house, and everything in it, and the Good Street and the theatre box. Gone, Mrs. Ashford wept that she had no one, no child, no near kin, no friend, who would not vanish the moment the shame was known. She said it plainly, through her tears, that she had no one and nothing in all the world. She said it to Honora, without once seeming to notice that Honora was a someone, sitting right there holding her hand. And Honora, this is the thing, this is the whole heart of her, Honora felt only pity. Not triumph. You might have forgiven her a little triumph. Here was the woman she had served for 11 years, the woman who had never once read the book her own companion wrote, the woman who let the world drop gloves at Honora's feet and never thought to stop it. Here was that woman, ruined, weeping that she had nothing. Honora felt no triumph at all. She felt only that a kind, foolish, frightened old woman was about to lose her home, and that something ought to be done. She did not yet know what. That evening, when the house was quiet and Mrs. Ashford had cried herself to sleep, Honora went up to her small cold room at the top of the house, and she lit her candle end, and she took the rosewood box onto her knees, and she unlocked it. Inside was the pen. Inside was the ink that stained her finger. And inside was the manuscript, the second novel, the one she had been writing for 2 years by candle end, the sequel that half of London did not even know to long for, and yet already longed for. Because everyone who had wept over the Hawthorne legacy was aching, without a name for the ache, for more. It was nearly finished, a few chapters short. A winter's more work, perhaps. She looked at it for a long time. The rain came down the window. Downstairs an old woman slept who thought she had no one. And in Honora's careful head, slowly, a whole shape was forming, a shape made of £90 once taken, of a small royalty, of a name that was not a name, of a bank that wanted £4,000, of a manuscript nearly done. She did not weep. The time for weeping, if it had ever come, had gone. Her plain face, in the candlelight, was doing something it rarely allowed itself to do. It was setting, hardening, deciding. She reached for a fresh sheet of paper, and she dipped the pen, and she began to write a letter. Not a novel. A letter to Mr. Absalom Reed, publisher, the one man alive who knew that Gideon Hart wore a grey gown and fetched the shawls. What she wrote in that letter and what it set in motion is the whole of the rest of this story. But I must tell you one more thing before we close this first part, because it happened in those same grey weeks, and it changes everything, and Honora did not see it coming any more than the Tun saw her. She met a man at a lending library. She had gone to change Mrs. Ashford's novels, as she did every week, a dull errand in a dull rain. And at the shelf she reached for the same volume as a stranger, and their hands nearly met on the spine, and they both drew back, and they both laughed, and then, because he was a plain-spoken man of no fashion whatever, and because she was tired of being invisible, they fell to talking. His name was Edmund Carraway. He was a barrister, 34, with an honest square face and not a scrap of style about him, the sort of man the Tun would never trouble to invite anywhere. And he had, in his hand, a copy of the Hawthorne legacy. They talked about it, standing there among the shelves, in the rain light, a plain man and a plain woman. They talked about the book all London was quoting, and Edmund Carraway said something that stopped Honora's breath in her throat. He told her what he thought it meant. And he was right. Alone of every soul she had heard hold forth on that book all season, alone against Sir Julian Frayne and all his admired essays, this unfashionable barrister in a wet coat understood exactly what she had meant. Not the soldier's glory Frayne had invented, the woman's endurance she had actually written. He had read her true. He had looked at the words and seen her without knowing there was a her to see. They talked for an hour. She could not help herself. It was the first hour in 11 years that anyone had spoken to her mind as an equal, not knowing it was famous, wanting nothing from it but its company. And when at last she made herself go, and gathered up Mrs. Ashford's novels and her rosewood box, Mr. Carraway asked, with a shy plainness that undid her a little, whether she might be at the library again next week. She said, perhaps that she might. She walked home in the rain, not knowing whether she had just found the first true friend of her life, or the deadliest danger to her secret, because a man who could read her, that clearly might, one careless day, read the rest. She held the rosewood box close against the wet. Inside it, the ink not yet dry on a letter to Mr. Reed, was a plan that would either save an old woman's house and cost Honora everything, or be discovered before it was done, and cost her everything anyway. 61 days to Michaelmas. £4,000. A secret 11 years deep. And a barrister who saw too much. She had made her decision. Now she only had to survive it. Mr. Reed's answer came back in 4 days, which for Mr. Reed was a headlong rush. He was not a man who hurried. He had told her once that a book, like a pudding, was ruined by heat. But he had read her letter twice, he wrote, and then a third time standing by the window, and he had done a thing he never did. He had made up his mind at once. He would take the sequel. He would pay £4,200 against it, and he would do exactly as she asked. She read that last part, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, the candle burned down to a thumb's width, the house asleep below her. £4,200. She had sold the first book for £9.80, a flat £9.80, and glad of it, 2 years ago, when £90 had stood between her and the street. She had never once imagined a number like this one attached to her own hand. And she was going to give nearly all of it away to a woman who had never read a line she wrote. The contract came the following week, folded inside a plain wrapper so that no maid would wonder. She waited until the small hours to open it. She spread it on the lid of the rosewood box, on her knees on the cold floor, and she read every clause the way she read everything, slowly, with the care of a woman who has learned that no one will catch her mistakes for her. There was a place for Gideon Hart to sign. She dipped the pen. Her middle finger was stained already, the old stain, the one no lie had ever lifted. A little fresh ink joined it now. She wrote the name that was not a name. Gideon Hart. 11 years she had been a shadow in other people's houses, and 2 of those years she had been famous, and no one alive had ever seen her write those 2 words but herself and one grey publisher in a back office off the Strand. Then she wrote the instruction beneath, in the plain clerk's hand she used for business. The advance was not to come to her. Not a shilling of it. £4,000 of it was to be paid, quietly and through Mr. Reed's own solicitor, to the Bank of Coutance and Hollis against the mortgage held in the name of Mrs. Cordelia Ashford. It was to be paid as though from an anonymous well-wisher. No name, no note, nothing that could be traced back to a companion who ought not to have had £4,000 to her name. The remaining 200 she kept. It was more than she had ever held at once. It felt like nothing at all beside what she was letting go. She did not weep. She did not feel noble. She felt, if anything, a little frightened, the way you feel at the top of a long stair in the dark. She had just spent a winter's more work, the last chapters, the ones the manuscript still wanted, before she had earned a penny of it. She had bound herself to finish a book she had not finished, to save a house that was not hers, for a woman who did not know her name. She blotted the page. She sealed it. In the morning she posted it herself, walking to the receiving office before Mrs. Ashford was awake, and she dropped it through the slot and stood a moment with her gloved hand still against the cold brass. There it was done. There was no taking it back. She thought, walking home in the thin early light, that she had never done anything so entirely her own. Nobody would ever know. That was the whole of it, and the beauty of it, and the ache of it, altogether. The house did not know its own reprieve was in the post. Mrs. Ashford came down at noon with her eyes swollen, and spoke of the mortgage in a low, broken voice, as she had every day for a week, and Honora poured her chocolate and said the soothing nothings that were her trade. 61 days to Michaelmas had become 50, then 40. The old woman counted them aloud like a prisoner. She did not know that the debt was already in a solicitor's ledger in the slow act of dissolving. Honora let her fear go on. There was no way to comfort it without confessing everything. So she carried the shawl and warmed the chocolate and held her secret the way she had learned to hold every heavy thing, steadily and without a sound. Meanwhile, London had gone mad on a rumour. Gideon Hart, it was said, had been seen. Nobody could say by whom, exactly, or where, but the thing had the shape of truth by the second telling, and the certainty of gospel by the 10th. Gideon Hart was in town. Gideon Hart would be at the season's great gatherings. Every hostess in Mayfair believed she might yet net the great man for a Thursday evening. And every drawing-room hummed with the question of who he was. Sir Julian Frayne had an answer. Of course he had an answer. He had it at 3 parties in a fortnight, delivered each time as though newly minted. Gideon Hart, he said, was without doubt a nobleman. The refinement of the prose, the loftiness of the sentiment, the sheer command of it, These were not the marks of a tradesman's son. No, these were the marks of blood. He had narrowed it, he said, to a certain reclusive earl, a man of great estates and greater shyness, who wrote in secret and shunned the vulgar noise of fame. He staked his name on it. He said as much, laughing, a glass in his hand. "I will eat my own essays," he said, "if Gideon Hart proves to be anything less than a peer." Honora stood by the wall where the companion stood, holding Mrs. Ashford's fan, and heard him narrow the authorship of her own book to a man who did not exist. She kept her face still. She had had long practice keeping her face still. But something in her, some tired and defiant thing, filed the sentence away. "I will eat my own essays." She thought she should like to remember that, whatever came. There was one warmth in those weeks, and it was the only thing that frightened her more than the debt. She went back to the lending library. She told herself she went for Mrs. Ashford's novels. She knew she lied. And Mr. Edmund Carraway was there, in the same wet coat, or its brother, with a book under his arm and that plain waiting look on his face that lifted, when he saw her, into something she had no word for, and would not let herself name. They talked again. Not for an hour this time. For longer, and neither of them marked it, until the light went and the boy came round to trim the lamps. He did not talk to her as men talk to companions, over her head, past her, at the mistress she stood behind. He talked to her as though her answer were the thing he had come for. He argued with her. He was wrong about a scene in the 3rd volume, and she told him so, plainly, and instead of stiffening he laughed and said she might be right, and then a moment later said she was right, and looked pleased about it, as though being bested were a small, unexpected gift. She had never in her life been argued with as an equal by a man who thought he was arguing with a nobody. And then, one grey afternoon by the returns desk, he stopped in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely and said, not smoothly at all, that he had come to think of these hours as the best of his week, that he did not know her circumstances and did not care for them, that he was a barrister of no fashion and less fortune, but that if she would permit him to call, properly, on her mistress like an honest man, he would count it the luckiest thing that had happened to him. She should have said yes. Every plain and human part of her wanted to say yes. She said instead that he was very kind, and that her position did not allow for callers, and she gathered up the books too quickly, and her hands were not steady, because she saw it whole, in that instant, the way she saw the flaws in a manuscript. If he called, he would come to know her. If he came to know her, he would come, being who he was, to see her. And a man who could read the true meaning of the Hawthorne legacy off the page, who had looked at her words and seen the woman in them without being told there was a woman. That man, given time and love and her own careless happiness, would one day read the rest. And then she would not be a companion with a secret. She would be a companion who had lied to her employer, who had money she could not explain, who was, in the eyes of the world, a fraud and possibly a thief. She would lose the post. She would lose the roof. She would lose the small, hard independence she had bled 11 years to keep. So she kept herself from him, gently, which was worse than cruelly. She saw the plain hope go out of his face and be replaced by a plain man's careful courtesy, and she carried that home too, and it was heavier than the fan. The crisis, when it came at a house party in the country, 3 weeks before Michaelmas. Mrs. Ashford had been invited, out of long habit rather than affection, to a Friday to Monday at a great cold house in Hertfordshire, and Honora came, as she always came, in the train of the luggage, to warm the rooms and find the spectacles and be nowhere and everywhere at once. Miss Seraphina Blythe was there. So was Sir Julian Frayne. The season's talk had followed them all down from town, and the talk was still Gideon Hart, always Gideon Hart, and Miss Blythe had grown feverish upon the subject. For Miss Blythe had understood something, in her narrow, clever way. She had understood that to marry Frayne was to marry the man who owned the season's genius by interpretation, but that to lay hands on the genius himself. To be the one who unmasked Gideon Hart would be worth more than any marriage. It would make her the most talked-of woman in London for a year. And Miss Blythe had noticed the companion's box. She had noticed how Honora carried it, how she never let a maid touch it, how it was locked. A companion, a paid nobody, guarding a locked writing box as though it held the crown jewels. It had caught even Miss Blythe's shallow eye, and worried at it until on the Sunday, while the house was at church and Honora was kept below arranging Mrs. Ashford's medicines, Miss Blythe went up to the little cold room the companion had been given under the eaves. The box was there. It was locked. Miss Blythe was not a patient woman, and there was a paper knife on the writing table. She forced it. Honora came up the back stair at noon and found her door open and the girl standing at the window with the manuscript in her hands. The sequel. The near-finished sequel. Every page of it in the same hand, the fair, close, sloping hand that Honora used only for this, only for the books, the hand that had signed Gideon Hart on a contract not a month before. Miss Blythe held it up, her lovely face lit with a terrible triumph, and her voice when she spoke had already found its pitch for an audience. "Gideon Hart," she said, "in your box, in your hand." Honora did not move. "You copied it," Miss Blythe went on, delight running under the words like a stream. "You've been copying his pages, stealing them, a companion, with the great man's unpublished work locked in a box." Her eyes came up, bright and merciless. "Everyone is downstairs. They are just come from church. I think they should all like to know what Mrs. Ashford's little shadow keeps under her lock." And she swept past Honora with the manuscript clutched to her breast, down the great stair, into the drawing-room where the house party was assembling for the cold Sunday luncheon, some 40 souls, the same fashionable world that had laughed at a shilling, and she cried out that she had proof that the plain companion was a thief. Honora came down behind her because there was nowhere else to go. The room turned. She saw it turn. She saw Mrs. Ashford's face go from bewilderment to a dawning dreadful shame, her own companion, accused of theft before all these people. She saw Sir Julian Frayne, glass in hand, tilt his head with the slow pleasure of a man who scents a scene. She saw the pages in Miss Blythe's grip, her pages, her second book, the winter's more work she had not yet been paid for, held up like a hanging warrant. "Here," Miss Blythe said, and her voice rang, "Gideon Hart's own writing, pages no printer has seen. And where does one find them? In the locked box of a lady's paid companion. I ask you, how does such a creature come by the unpublished work of the greatest author of the age?" There is only one answer. She took it. The murmur that went round the room was the worst sound Honora had ever heard. It was not a gasp. It was a settling. It was 40 people deciding, in the space of a breath, that of course, the nobody was a thief. What else would she be? Sir Julian Frayne set down his glass. He did not hurry. He crossed the carpet with the ease of a man who owns every room he enters, and he took the topmost page from Miss Blythe's hand, and he read a line of it. And his eyebrows rose in a fine performance of contempt. "Well," he said, "someone has certainly been playing at authorship. A servant's copy of a master's line." He looked at Honora over the page, and his mouth curled. "You understand, I suppose, that this is beyond a jest. This is Mr. Hart's property. This is the law." He was so certain, that was the thing. He was so entirely, comfortably certain that the woman before him could not have written a word of it, that the very idea was beneath discussion, that the only question was how severely to deal with her theft. And he made then the mistake of his life. He decided to prove it. "Let me show you all," he said, warming, turning to the room, "how far this poor creature is from understanding what she has copied. Let me show you the gulf between the mind that wrote these words and the hand that stole them. He held the manuscript aside and lifted his own voice into the practiced cadence of his lectures, and he began to recite, not from the stolen pages, but from the Hawthorne Legacy itself, the famous passage, the one all London quoted. The one he had built 3 essays upon. He recited it as a soldier's boast, as glory, as the swelling of a great man's pride before battle. That was how he had always read it, in every essay, in every drawing-room, the martial nobility of Gideon Hart's finest scene. He got it wrong, as he had always got it wrong. And Honora, who had stood silent through the shilling and the shawl and 11 years of being no one, stood there with her own life burning down around her, and could not, at the last, let him get it wrong. She finished the paragraph. She did not raise her voice. She spoke it low, the way she had first heard it, the way she had written it by candle end, with her father 4 months dead, and the rent due. She took it up where he faltered, and she carried it to its true end, and it was not a soldier's glory at all. It was a woman's endurance. It was the thing she had actually meant. The strength that does not shine, that no one toasts, that holds a house together in the dark while the world writes odes to the men at the front. She spoke it as it was written, and then she spoke the last line, the line that answered it, and that line was in no printed copy anywhere in England, because it had never been printed. It lived only in one place. It lived in the sequel in Miss Blythe's hands, and in the mind that had made it. The room went entirely still. Sir Julian Frayne's mouth was open. No sound came out of it. She watched him hear it, watched him understand that she had finished the passage more truly than he ever had, that she had corrected him, in front of 40 people, on the meaning of the book he had staked his name upon, and then watched a colder thing arrive behind his eyes as he realized the last line was not one he knew. Could not be one he knew. Was not, could not be, anywhere he could have read it. That last line, he said, and his voice had lost its silk. Where is that from? That is not in the book. No, Honora said. It is not in the book. It is in the one she is holding. The silence had a weight now. Miss Blythe looked down at the pages in her hands, as though they had grown hot. How, said Frayne, very slowly, does a companion who has never read the sequel finish a sentence from it that no living soul has read? And there was no answer to that question that was not the answer. She saw them all begin to arrive at it, one face after another, the impossible sum coming right. She might have run. She might have lied. She had lied for 11 years, and was good at it. She was too tired to lie. Send to town, she said into the awful quiet, for Mr. Absalom Reed, of Reed and Sons, publishers. He will tell you whose hand that is. And then this poor foolish girl may put down my pages, for she has not stolen them. She has merely opened a box that was not hers, and found in it exactly what she was afraid to find. A woman who wrote a book. Mr. Reed came the next afternoon. They had kept her, in the interval, in a kind of suspended disgrace, not quite arrested, not quite believed, watched. She had spent the night in the little cold room without her box, and had not slept, and had found, somewhat to her surprise, that under the fear there was a strange lightness, like the ache after a tooth is drawn. The thing she had guarded for 11 years was, one way or another, about to be over. The drawing-room was fuller than before when Mr. Reed was shown in. Word had gone out overnight, the way such words go, and the 40 had become nearer 60. All the neighbouring houses come to see the companion hanged, or the companion vindicated. They scarcely cared which so long as there was a scene. Mrs. Ashford sat white and rigid by the fire. Miss Blythe stood apart, the manuscript surrendered now to a side table, her lovely face working between defiance and the first cold touch of doubt. Sir Julian Frayne stood by the mantel with his arms folded and his chin high, a man determined to be proved right. Mr. Reed was 55 and grey and dressed like a country attorney, and he came into that glittering room without the smallest sign that it impressed him. He had a leather case under his arm. He set it on the central table, unhurried, and he opened it, and he looked round at the fine assembled faces with a mild and level eye. "I am told," he said, "that a young lady has accused Miss Vane of stealing the work of my author, Mr. Gideon Hart, and that Sir Julian Frayne is of the opinion that Mr. Hart is a nobleman of his acquaintance." He let that sit a moment. "I have come a long way on a bad road to set both matters right." He drew out the first paper. "This is the contract for the Hawthorne legacy. Dated the spring of 1852. Signed, as you see, Gideon Hart." He laid it flat. "And this, a second paper, is the contract for the sequel, the very manuscript that lies on that table there, signed not 1 month ago. The same hand. You may all look. I encourage you to look." They looked. There was a shuffling forward, a craning. "And this," said Mr. Reed, and he lifted from the case a worn bundle tied in faded tape, "is the original manuscript of the Hawthorne legacy, in the author's own hand. The hand that wrote every word you have all been quoting to one another for 2 years. He set it beside the contracts, the same hand as the sequel, the same hand as the signature. I have watched this hand write for 2 years, in my own office, by my own lamp. I know it as I know my own." He straightened, and he looked directly at Sir Julian Frayne, and he said the thing plainly, without any pleasure in it, which made it worse. "Gideon Hart has never been a man. There is no earl. There is no nobleman. You have been quoting Miss Honora Vane all season." Nobody laughed. Sir Julian Frayne did not move for a moment. Then Honora saw the colour go out of his face, not a flush drained, but the slower thing. The grey coming up under the skin like water under thin ice. He looked at the contracts. He looked at the manuscript. He looked at the companion he had offered a shilling to carry another man's essays, the shadow he had toasted over, the creature he had just yesterday declared too far beneath the author to understand a copied line. And she watched him do the sum that could not be unmade. Every essay he had published on Gideon Hart, every rapturous lecture, every certainty about the martial nobility, the peer's refinement, the loftiness of blood. He had built his whole reputation as the age's finest critic upon interpreting a mind, and the mind was hers, and he had degraded it to her face, in this room, over and over, while explaining it to the world. He opened his mouth. She saw him reach for an argument, any argument, the reflex of a man who had never in his life lacked something clever to say. And there was nothing there. Every argument he owned about that book was hers. She had put them into his mouth without either of them knowing it. He had no thought about the Hawthorne legacy that had not started in her candle-end nights. He stood in front of 60 people with his lips parted and found the cupboard bare. Mr. Reed was not finished. He turned the case toward Mrs. Ashford, gently now, for he was not a cruel man, and he had seen the old woman shaking by the fire. "There is one further matter," he said, "which Miss Vane did not authorize me to speak of, and which I shall speak of anyway, because I am too old to watch a good deed go into an unmarked grave." He drew out a last paper. The sequel that this young lady called stolen, the manuscript on that table, was sold to me for an advance of £4,200, and by the express written instruction of its author, 4,000 of those pounds were paid, some weeks ago and without a name attached, to the Bank of Coathants and Hollis. He looked at Mrs. Ashford, against a mortgage, "Madam, held upon this family. Yours, it is cleared. It has been cleared these 3 weeks. Your anonymous benefactor has been sitting behind your chair the whole season, carrying your fan." Mrs. Ashford made a sound that was not a word. She turned in her chair and looked at Honora as though she had never seen her before, and in a true sense she never had. Not really. Not once in all the years the girl had warmed her rooms and found her spectacles and held her secrets. The companion she had never thanked. the companion whose book she had never opened, though all London devoured it. The plain nobody who had, in silence, without a syllable of credit, paid £4,000 she did not have to save an old woman's house. Mrs. Ashford's hand came out, trembling across the space between them. And she took Honora's hand, the right hand, the ink-stained one, the one with the mark on the middle finger that no soap had ever lifted, the hand that not one soul in 2 years had thought to look at. She held it in both of hers and bent her head over it and wept, and this time the weeping was not for herself. "I never read it," she whispered. "I never even read it." "I know," Honora said. And she was not bitter. That was the strange thing she would remember. She found she was not bitter at all. It doesn't matter now. The room began then to sort itself, each according to what he or she was made of. Miss Seraphina Blythe stood by the side table where the surrendered manuscript lay, and she was left holding, in the eyes of everyone present, the proof of the woman she had tried to destroy. She had forced the box to find a thief, and had instead uncovered a genius, and had announced it to all society, and there was no undoing that either. She looked round for the triumph she had come down for, and found the whole room's face turned away from her by some silent common motion, the way a crowd turns from a bad smell. "I only meant," she began, and her voice was high and thin, "I only meant to see, anyone would have thought, the box was locked, one naturally supposed, and that was her sentence, and it hanged her, for it was all excuse and no shame, and the room heard it for what it was." A hostess near the door said, not quite under her breath, that Miss Blythe must be tired after such an exciting morning, and perhaps would wish to lie down, and it was said in the tone one uses to remove a person from the world. Miss Blythe's name, though no one announced it, left the season in that moment. She went out of the room alone, and no one marked her going, but the footman who opened the door. Sir Julian Frayne found his voice at last. It cost him. She could see that it cost him everything he had. He was a proud man, and vanity was the whole architecture of him, and what he had to do now was pull it down with his own hands in front of the world that had built him up. "Mr." Reed stood there, grey and immovable, an authority he could not out-talk, a witness he could not sneer away. And the manuscript lay on the table in a hand that was not a peer's, and his 3 essays were ash. He unfolded his arms. He looked at Honora, really looked, perhaps for the first time in the 2 years he had spent in rooms with her. And he bowed his head, a small stiff bow, but a bow, and he said the one true thing she ever heard him say. "Then," said Sir Julian Frayne, "I have understood nothing. It was not gracious, it was not warm, but it was true, and it plainly hurt him to say it, and Honora thought that a true thing said at cost was worth more than 100 pretty ones said cheap." She inclined her head to him. She did not gloat. She had no wish to. She had spent 11 years being made small, and had discovered in the strangest hour of her life that she had no appetite at all for making anyone else small in return. There was a movement at the edge of the crowd, and Mr. Edmund Carraway stepped forward. She had not known he was there. He had come down, it seemed, with one of the neighbouring parties, a barrister of no fashion, invited to make up a table, and he had stood at the back through all of it, and now he came through the parting crowd in his plain coat, with his plain face open as a door. She braced herself. This was the part she had feared most of all. Now he knew. Now the man who had loved her conversation, who had argued with her as an equal, who had wanted nothing from her but her company, now he would learn that all along he had been talking to fame. And it would curdle, it always curdled, the knowing always changed the loving. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment. "I knew," he said quietly, "that I was talking to the best mind I had ever met. I told you your reading of the 3rd volume was right. It was right because it was yours." A slow, plain smile. "I loved the mind before I had a name to hang on it. I am only glad now to know the name." And it did not curdle. It was the opposite of curdling. She had guarded her secret 11 years, believing that to be known was to be lost, and here stood a man to whom being known had only made her dearer, and the whole architecture of her fear cracked quietly across. She did not fall into his arms. That was not the kind of woman she was, and it was a crowded room. But she looked at him, and she let him see her look. And that was more than she had let anyone see in a very long time. Then she turned to Mr. Reed, and she thanked him for coming, for the bad road, for the truth plainly told. She went to the side table and gathered up her manuscript, the winter's more work, the near-finished pages, and she put them back where they belonged. Someone had brought down her box. It stood on a chair by the door, the lock forced and useless now, the lid a little sprung. She did not mind. It did not need to lock any more. She held it against her, the way she had held it in the rain. And she asked, of no one and of everyone, only one thing. She asked to go home. 6 months on, there is a small, bright parlour with rain on the glass. It is not a grand house. Mrs. Ashford's house was saved, but it was more house than either of them wanted after all that, and there was talk, gentle talk, the kind between two women who have learned to sit together in the evenings, of taking something smaller and warmer, and they did. The parlour faces west. The fire is good. The rain comes soft against the window the way it comes in this country, more often than not, and neither of them minds it. The rosewood box is open on the table. It does not lock now, and no one has thought to mend it, because there is nothing left to hide. A fresh page lies half-filled beside it. The ink stain is still on Honora's middle finger, dark and permanent, and she has stopped scrubbing at it. She wears it now the way a married woman wears her ring, without thinking, and glad of it, the mark of the thing she is. Mrs. Ashford sits by the fire in the evenings and reads the new pages aloud as Honora finishes them. She reads slowly and stops to say when a part moves her, and she has read every word of the Hawthorne legacy now, twice, and speaks of it as though she cannot quite believe she once shared a house with its author and never opened it. I was a foolish old woman, she says, and Honora says, you were only a busy one, and neither of them believes the kind version, and both of them prefer it. A note came, some weeks ago, from Sir Julian Frayne's circle. An invitation to a Thursday evening, very warmly worded, all the old grandeur turned now to courtship of the genius they had missed. Honora answered it in 6 words, in her own fair hand. Miss Vane regrets she is writing. She hears that Miss Blythe married a man in the wine trade and lives in Bath, and that her name is no longer on the season's lists, and Honora finds she thinks of the girl without any anger at all, only a kind of distant pity for a woman who could look at a locked box and think the only thing worth wanting was inside it, when the thing worth wanting had been standing beside her, holding a fan. Mr. Edmund Carraway sits across the hearth most evenings now. He has a way of reading her pages over her shoulder that ought to be maddening and somehow is not. This evening he reaches across and taps the page, gently, and tells her she has wanted a comma, just there, after the turn of the sentence, and she looks, and he is right, and she takes up the pen and puts it in. She lets him. That is the whole of it. For 11 years she let no one see a single word before it was printed and safe. And now she lets a plain barrister lean over her shoulder in the firelight and correct her comma. And she puts it in because he is right, and because being seen, it turns out, was never the danger. Being unseen was. The world will memorize your words. It will quote them at dinner and build careers on them and toast the mind that made them. And it will still, somehow, refuse to look at your hands, until one careless evening, when you are too tired to lie, the truth insists on being looked at, and everything you feared would cost you everything turns out to be the only thing that ever set you free. The rain goes on against the glass. The fire settles. Somewhere the season roars along without them, quoting Gideon Hart, and here in the warm small room the woman who is Gideon Hart licks the point of her pen and bends to the page and writes the next true line by a light she no longer has to hide. Comment the last book that changed you. Honora would want to know.